What if the most powerful woman in ancient history wasn't just a seductress, but a master of the mind? Cleopatra faced betrayals, wars, and the whims of empires, yet she held on to her throne with an almost supernatural calm. She reaches us through a fog machine built by Rome. Octavian needed the conflict to feel tidy. Rome versus Antony looks like a civil war, Roman killing Roman. On the other hand, Rome versus Cleopatra becomes a foreign war, a story citizens can swallow. Cassius Dio spells out the maneuver. War declared on Cleopatra in name, with Antony as the real target. After that, the moralizing makes sense. Virgil drips contempt at Antony's Egyptian wife. Horace calls her fatale monstrum, a doom-laden monster. That is ritual language, designed to turn fear into loyalty. So psychology has to be hunted in the places the propaganda slips. Plutarch, no friend writing romance, says her beauty failed to stun on sight, yet her conversation carried an irresistible charm, her voice a kind of instrument. Influence through interaction, through timing, through how she makes you feel inside the room. Stoicism begins with a crude, life-saving cut. What answers to you, and what never will? Cleopatra's world punished anyone who blurred that line. A queen can command guards, coin, grain, titles, but she cannot command how Rome frames her. She cannot command how a poet makes the crowd laugh, or whether a general's pride twists into betrayal. Rome's writers show the outside of that storm. They keep returning to luxury, intoxication, contamination. It is a way of saying, this threat is external, so hatred is honorable. Cleopatra seems to have understood the trap. You do not win by begging to be seen fairly, but by acting inside the territory you can still move. So she worked the controllables: access, attention, and first impressions. Plutarch's aside about her charm matters because it hints at method. The charm lives in conversation, in tone, in responsiveness. Those are choices that can be trained. A woman in a court where every smile hides a blade learns quickly that outcomes drift, yet decisions still stack. In the popular record, Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt. Once that label sticks, every decision gets read through an ending that hasn't happened yet. She couldn't afford that kind of mental drift. She acted like the future was still negotiable, even while the walls tightened, because posture under pressure is one of the few things nobody can vote away. When slander spread in Rome, she did not waste breath trying to disinfect it. She built legitimacy where it paid. She spoke to Egyptians as a queen of Egypt with religious grammar they recognized. She made foreign envoys deal with her directly. She kept the state functioning, which is the only rebuttal that counts when propaganda grows teeth. There is a kind of violence in that restraint. Imagine hearing your name turned into a monster word in someone else's capital, then returning to ledgers, ship manifests, temple rites, the small scratch of a stylus. Control, for her, did not mean certainty. It meant choosing where to spend fear, and she did it on preparation instead of begging. A ruler under threat learns a brutal lesson. If you let other people define you first, you spend the rest of the year chasing their shadow. Cleopatra moved early, even when it looked reckless. Plutarch tells the story of her slipping into Caesar's presence at night, smuggled in a bed sack because the palace around her had already chosen sides. Maybe the details got polished over time. The pattern rings true. She refused to wait outside the door while enemies narrated her as weak, guilty, obsolete. She engineered the first impression with her own hands. This is where stoic control turns physical. You cannot control who wants your throne, but you can control the meeting that decides whether you keep breathing. So she made proximity happen. Caesar and Cleopatra becomes, in Roman memory, scandal and gossip. Underneath sits a strategic fact. She placed herself close enough to the world's most dangerous man that her survival became his problem too. Picture the hush of corridors, torch smoke, linen shifting, one loyal ally carrying her like contraband. Fear stays present. It never gets to steer alone. Even betrayal inside the family follows this logic. Ptolemy XIII's faction, recorded later as plotting and counterplotting, pushed Cleopatra into exile and civil conflict. She could have turned that wound into identity, a queen defined by grievance. Instead, she treated it as terrain. She returned with allies, she forced contact, and she kept moving. Watch what she does after setbacks. She does not linger at the altar of misfortune, but she narrows choices, then commits. That is the dichotomy again, practiced without sermons. Action stays inside her jurisdiction, and the verdict of the crowd stays outside it. The Cleopatra story, told as romance, misses the colder beat. Seduction is temporary. Access is durable. A calm face at the right moment can buy armies, coin, legitimacy. You hear it in Plutarch's unwilling admiration. Presence, voice, something stimulating. That is control exerted through the nerves of others. She did not conquer chance, but refused to kneel to it. Stoics talk about an inner citadel, a place you keep intact while the city burns. Cleopatra had to build one in public, under lamps, with witnesses taking notes. Plutarch says her tongue was like an instrument of many strings, and that she rarely needed an interpreter. Trivia, if you live in a safe century. In hers, interpreters were filters, leaks, and sometimes knives. Direct speech collapses distance. It also creates a private channel inside a crowded world. You can see why Cleopatra invested there. The court runs on misheard phrases. Language also anchored legitimacy. Plutarch adds that earlier Ptolemies barely tried to learn the native tongue. Whether every detail is precise, the contrast lands. Cleopatra refused to rule Egypt like a detached landlord. She cultivated the feeling of rightful presence, the kind that settles in people's bones. Temples, titles, ritual, the careful placement of her image, all of it worked as narrative warfare long before Rome branded her as a monster. And behind the velvet sits vigilance. Chronic threat trains a ruler to test loyalties, to keep relationships layered, to treat retreat as a kind of death. She could look serene while calculating exits, when listening for the scrape of sandals outside a door, or while measuring which priesthood might drift next. This is where the dichotomy of control becomes art. Rome's respect stayed outside her reach. Egypt was different. She tightened loyalty at home, staged authority through temples and titles, and made subjects meet her story, even when they never met her body. Hostile writers describe this staging as excess. Plutarch's scene of her arriving to meet Antony reads like deliberate psychology. Gilded stern, purple sails, silver oars, a canopy spangled with gold. Cleopatra posed like Venus. It sets the emotional weather before a word is spoken. Antony steps into that weather and starts making choices inside it. A queen who can shape atmosphere can also shape outcomes up close. The inner citadel holds steady. Then the theater does its work. By the time Rome turned its full attention toward Egypt, Cleopatra had already learned the core Stoic skill. Accept the parts of the world that refuse your grip, then squeeze what remains. Octavian's framing made her the enemy. Once the Senate could point at a foreign queen, the war felt righteous. That is why the language hardens into monster talk. Fear works better when the target sounds less human. Yet even that propaganda admits her power. A threat needs to be named. Inside that vice, she kept doing the same thing. She forced decisive contact. She made the room happen before opponents could seal it. Antony and Cleopatra, in the popular imagination, becomes romance. In practice, it was an alliance conducted under spectacle and surveillance. She used pleasure, yes, and pageantry, yet the deeper weapon was steadiness. Antony, proud and porous, could be steered by mood. Cleopatra shaped that mood. Then came defeat, and the stoic task arrives with a dull thud. Ships lost, friends hedging, messages growing colder. A lesser ruler begs the universe to reverse itself. Cleopatra looked for remaining leverage. Egypt still fed Rome. Her person still carried symbolic weight. She tried negotiation, and when negotiation failed, she protected the one domain no enemy can annex. That last act, whether you read it as tragedy or strategy, follows the same inner logic as the bedsack night. She also understood the cost. Every choice tightened the circle around her children and her court. Calm becomes lonely when everyone suspects it is a mask. Picture the clink of bracelets in a silent chamber, maps unrolled, ink drying, servants pretending they hear nothing. The inner citadel keeps standing, yet it stands alone still tonight. She refused to be paraded. She chose her terms. Control shrank to a single point, then held. There is no clean moral at the end. There is only a woman who understood that reputation is a battlefield, and sometimes the final move is to deny your opponent the image they came to harvest. The easiest Cleopatra to sell is the one Rome wanted: a spell, a scandal, a foreign fever. That version flatters Roman virtue and lets later audiences enjoy the story without feeling implicated. The harder Cleopatra is the one you meet when you pay attention to control. She lived with constant threat and still kept her attention narrow. She treated insults as weather. She treated fear as fuel for preparation. When a room could be engineered, she engineered it. When a rumor could not be stopped, she ignored it and strengthened what still functioned. That looks like Stoicism, because Stoicism is the language we have for that kind of restraint. Yet she learned it the ugly way, by watching how fast thrones vanish when a ruler chases approval. She chose a different addiction: clarity, timing, the discipline of not reacting on command. If you listen carefully, even hostile sources slip and give her credit. They describe the effect she had in conversation, the way men drifted into her orbit and stayed there longer than prudence allowed. That is mind work, practiced with a calm face and a sharp ear. Cleopatra never got a fair archive. She got a warning label. Still, beneath the label, you can hear a quieter sentence: power breaks people who cannot govern themselves. She governed herself daily. If you want more psychological portraits like this, subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments who you want next.